calls. Ignore my wet hair, just got out of the shower. I know I said I wouldn't do a bunch of, tran videos, but I lied. No. But this one is particularly important to me, and I am gonna do the ones that are important to me because they're important to me. Yeehaw. No. Because, I think it's important, and I want to articulate my opinions in a way that everyone can understand, even cis people, because it is very hard to understand what being trans is when you're not trans, and it's hard to understand all the drama in the trans community if you're not trans, and etc. And this particular video is mostly moved by what is happening with ContraPoints, because I've been watching a lot of her videos, and to see, what she actually says and what she actually believes. And one thing she does actually seem to believe is that gender is a social construct. And she's very famous. And a lot of people listen to that. A lot of trans people listen to that. A lot of cis people listen to that. And I think it misrepresents what being trans is. The trans community is very attached to this idea right now, on certain sides. And it's interesting to me because it is the same rhetoric that TERFs use. In fact, it is rhetoric that TERFs started, as far as I know. Back in the 80s, the first mention of this ideology was in a TERF's book, and these were ideologies used to, they went to the government and said that, see, being trans is a result of society, so they don't need to transition, so insurance doesn't have to cover them. That is something that actually happened. That is a very concise way to say it. It's a lot more complicated than that, but it is something that actually happened. It is something you can go and look at it. And whether these women call themselves TERFs or not, no. I mean, they probably didn't even call themselves radical feminists at the time, but they did hold radical feminist ideologies, and some of them didn't hold feminist ideologies, but they still held transphobic ideologies like this. But the idea being that gender is a social construct, and it is inherently oppressive to women, and that men choosing to be women will never be women, etc., etc. And men choosing to be women is oppressive to women, stealing women's spaces, whatever. These were entirely used to paint trans people as, trans women specifically, because they don't give a fuck about trans men most of the time, as predators, and women as victims, cis women as innocent victims, But aside from that, aside from its roots, it is still something trans-exclusive radical feminists believe. They have entire communities around it, gender-critical, the idea that gender isn't real, the idea that it's an entirely social construct, and these people do believe that being trans is a result of society. They believe that dysphoria is a result of society. And so if you look back, at stuff, trans people didn't always believe this, and I don't know where the trans community got this, why they started believing this, but originally they believed it was similar, but it kind of spiraled out of control. They believed, well, first, you've got to look in the history of gender. Initially, gender wasn't a thing people used for humans. They used it for, gendered language. Like in Spanish, it was a gendered language, the gender of a chair, etc. But at one point, they started using gender as a euphemism for sex. And this was because they were prudes, and because sex had started to come to mean intercourse. So they started using gender as sex. They were the same thing. There was no difference. And then the trans community they kind of started using the two words as a way to explain ourselves, as a way to say that my gender is here and my sex is here and they don't match and that's why I'm transitioning. And this was just a way to explain, who we are to people who didn't quite understand. Gender, yeah, and that is what the term gender identity started as, just a way to explain to people who didn't understand. And this got kind of taken and it spiraled into the idea that you can just identify into something, the idea that, gender is just an identity, gender is just a social construct. It kind of all spiral together, and I think that's an issue, because gender's not a social construct. So, if I'm going to tell you what gender's not, I guess I have to tell you what I think gender is. Gender, the actual, what it actually is debated a lot, even by people who say it's a social construct, because then what is it? Is it how you're dressed? Is it how you're treated? Because a social construct relies on society to recognize it, so if society is not recognizing you as a woman, are you a woman? Etc. I believe that gender is at least partially rooted in neurology. And I believe this because this is what there's a lot of science to support it. It is to do with the neurological alignment of your brain, and that affects your body, that affects the way you see your body, affects the way you feel in your body, and therefore that affects the way that you relate to society. In my opinion, I liken it to autism in that it is neurological and incurable, but it also has both internal and external symptoms. A discomfort with eye contact would be more of a social symptom rather than an internal kind of thing. Because just not liking eye contact isn't inherently disordered. But we consider it an autistic symptom. It is the same thing, in my opinion, for social dysphoria. The way that people see us does affect how we feel, but it doesn't mean that's the only thing there is. It doesn't mean that's the cause. So I've read a bunch of studies, and I read a bunch of studies, and a bunch more. And there were studies on various parts of the brain in trans people in various stages of transition. And one thing that was definitely consistent was whether it was pre-transition, post-transition, as kids, whatever, is that the brain is at least slightly different in a trans person and a cis person. A trans person and a cis person of their sex, and a trans person and a cis person of their identified sex. Some people like to preach it as a trans man has the exact same brain as a cis man. Well, that's not true. A trans man has masculinized parts of the brain as a result of exposure to androgens in the womb. And part of the brain that is affected is the synapses responsible for self-recognition. Meaning that when a trans man is seeing his body as a female woman's body, the synapses just aren't firing correctly, and he is not recognizing the body as his own. But when the body, and this is of a pre-transition man, is overlaid with the body of a man, so that the body appears to be a male body, the synapses fire better, and the man recognizes the body more closely as his own. So, I guess that means, in my opinion, gender is how you relate to your body, but why does this make trans people valid as their gender? Quite frankly, this is a discussion that ContraPoints brought up. It's you know, every argument you make can be teared down by saying, well, why? Why does that make them valid? Why does not recognizing themselves as a woman make them valid as men? And this is the argument she used to then say, so why do we need an explanation at all? Why can't people just be? And I would agree. I would agree entirely if it weren't for the way that it impacts our lives as trans people. So why are trans people valid? Well, I don't know. But I do know that in this, so when you are recognizing yourself better, oh shoot, you didn't see that, it didn't happen. When you are recognizing yourself better, it's just healthier. And that requires transition, generally speaking. I mean, you can't cure that disconnect without it. And so, when you're transitioning, you functionally and societally become the sex you're identifying as. I mean, I don't function any differently in society than a man, and everybody recognizes me as a man. So it would be useless to, as, Blair said in her discussion with Ben Shapiro, it would be useless to say she, her in any setting, because nobody's going to recognize a she, her. So the only setting it really matters is a doctor, or something along those lines. But wait, doesn't that mean gender has to do with society? Maybe it does. If you look into gender roles, you'll find that people who are uncomfortable with their gender are also innately seem to be uncomfortable with gender roles. It doesn't matter if those roles are enforced on them. If you give a male monkey and a female monkey a choice, the female will probably choose the doll, and the male will probably choose a truck, or something along those lines, male and female toys. So maybe what it means is that gender is both social and neurological, wherein it is how we relate to our bodies and how we relate to society. What does this mean for non-binary people? I couldn't tell you. It's entirely possible that a non-binary person has a synapse that is failing to recognize male or female parts, and they want to be societally and internally recognized as a in-between, or something along those lines. It's kind of a mess. But we are humans. We seek out explanations for a reason. And to suggest we don't need one is invalidating for all the people who would like one, number one. And it is invalidating of the fact that without one, we are societally seen as not worthy of rights. People want an explanation. Why are you valid? Contra suggested it was along the lines of, the same thing as being gay. I mean, we don't seek out explanations for being gay, but yes, we do. We have been for years, and it has been a long time that gay people have been saying this is not a choice, this is innate. This is not societal, this is innate. This is not a result of trauma, this is innate. And trans people have every right to say that same thing. If somebody... But she also made a valid point in that a straight man who sleeps entirely with men is functionally gay. Yeah, but he's not straight. He's not a straight man. You know, he can identify as a straight man, but that won't change his internal feelings. If a gay man marries a woman, it won't change his internal feelings. He doesn't become straight. And so if a trans person, or even a cis person, is forced to live as the opposite sex, that they don't become cis. Their gender doesn't change, their innate feelings don't change. And you can see this in cases of botched circumcisions, where boys are transitioned to female as babies and raised as female, and it's very common for them to transition back to male. But it's actually not always. There are some that do continue to live as female. So, what is gender? Is gender social roles? The social role you take on? Is it entirely neurological? Is it entirely just the shape of your brain? Is it something else? I don't know, maybe it's a mixture. Maybe it's a mixture. I don't know if we'll ever fully know, but to seek out answers isn't a bad thing, and to say that a trans person who experiences dysphoria is inherently different than a person who takes on being trans as a social role, well, it's true. It's not a bad thing to separate the two. It's not a bad thing to separate, you know, political lesbians from people who are innately lesbians. There is a reason the label political lesbian exists. You know, a lot of these women are bisexual, choosing to only date women for political reasons, and that is not the same thing as being a lesbian. It is not the same thing to take on a social identity as it is to have this innate discomfort with your body. And this is why the trans community has become split over transgender versus transsexual. Because when transgender was first invented as a word, it meant transsexual, because transsexual was taken to be asexuality, and they wanted to get rid of that confusion. But now, transgender means anybody who does not completely conform to social norms. And yes, that's exactly what it means. That is how it is defined in medical standing, that you can be transgender even if you're just a man who likes wearing dresses, because it is seen as entirely social. And I think that is problematic. But if you're going to continue insisting these things, then you can't get mad at dysphoric people for reclaiming transsexual, because we want it to be clear that we are not transitioning due to society. I'm not transitioning due to society. I'm transitioning because every time I looked in a mirror before I transitioned, I dissociated. This doesn't look right on my body. My voice didn't sound right in my head. It's not the same thing. And I don't know if we'll ever have a clean answer. But trans people with dysphoria are not dysphoric because of society at all. Social dysphoria is a result of neurological dysphoria. And you probably shouldn't transition if you don't have body dysphoria. It's not a good idea. But body dysphoria is not constant self-hatred. Body dysphoria is a disconnect. It can be, failure to recognize the sex part of your bodies. It can be a lot of things. It's not the same for every person, and it's certainly not constant self-hatred. But yeah, I don't know. Peace. Cut in half a second back here to mention that I forgot to mention that dysphoria is also not the same thing as body dysmorphic disorder. Body dysmorphic disorder is where you are viewing your body in a way that is wrong. in a way that it doesn't exist. You are seeing yourself as fat when you are actually skinny. You're seeing your nose as being huge when it's actually a normal sized nose, etc. That is not the same thing as dysphoria, wherein you are seeing your body the way it is. You are simply not relating to it. But dysphoria can cause dysmorphia. And that is why it is important to see a therapist before you transition, because you have to be able to separate layers of things. You have to be able to separate, these feelings that could be a result of bullying, or these feelings that could be a result of this or that, from the feelings that are dysphoria.